Metal Gear Solid is so freaking cool, man. From the fun gunplay, to the global set pieces, to the masterful voice acting, to the technical achievements, there's a lot to love about nearly every entry in the franchise. If you ever wanted to just slip into the shoes of an Americanized secret agent with complicated feelings and a convoluted origin story, this is the franchise to play. Solid Snake was immediately iconic, and his image and aesthetic went on to influence spy thriller games for generations to come. I mean, hey, when other stealth video games from totally separate franchises are referencing you in the cutscenes, and the creator and director for the majority of your games gets placed on a holy pedestal like some Japanese entertainment god, you know you've left your mark on digital history. But the gargantuan, luscious forest that is the Metal Gear franchise has some pretty humble roots with its debut entry, the self-titled Metal Gear, made for the Japanese MSX2 in 1987. When this game came out, it was literally the first of its kind. A lot of other games that contained stealth elements didn't really try to make those mechanics good. Most of the time, getting spotted when you weren't supposed to just kind of put the game in a fail state and you had to reload from a checkpoint or something. But Metal Gear went out of its way to create a different style of gameplay that later became the standard of stealth games in general, and that was the introduction of an alert mode, where if the player got spotted by the enemy patrols, they're pursued by the guards, and more will spawn to chase you after they're either all dead or the player just exits the area and hides for long enough. This new stealth game mechanic revolution wasn't the only thing Metal Gear brought to the table either. The creator of the franchise, Hideo Kojima, is a well-known film nut. This guy adores movies from every generation from any genre. Kojima has said before that his family would sit down and watch a new movie every night after dinner, leading him to become well versed in media from a young age. After his father died when he was just 13 years old, Kojima made it his goal to go into college in a relevant field to provide for his family, but at the same time, he felt himself creeping more towards the arts. When he grew up, his goal was to create media in some way, and eventually found himself embroiled in the chaotic world of early video game design. It was through this film culture he was raised on that he worked hard to implement his many inspirations into his work. In 1986, he joined Konami's MSX home computer division, and after a year of getting to know the system architecture and assisting in products like Penguin Adventure, Kojima was asked to take over the lead on a project from a senior at the studio. It took some elbow grease to develop the vision for the project, but in the end Kojima was able to establish himself as a game design lead by finishing Metal Gear in 1987, and that game released to commercial and critical success in Japan and Europe. Many of Metal Gear's compliments were on the cinematic quality given to the title, with many critics praising the feeling of being in a spy thriller from the West. The stealth gameplay implemented in the game also heralded the dawn of the stealth action genre, and more games with similar mechanics began popping up as technology improved for video games across the board. Kojima would later go on to make other games while working for Konami, including a sci-fi adventure game inspired by Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, named Snatcher, and a deep space adventure game called Police Knots. Both games were praised for their focus on scientific accuracy and film production quality, and only fueled more ambition for the young game designer. Kojima began looking for new ways to realize his multimedia ambitions. However, it was at this time where a crazy divergence would happen, opening the door for many opportunities for both the businessmen of Konami and Hideo Kojima himself. Seeing the success of Metal Gear in Japan made Konami look to other shores to push their products to. Moving the game to European countries was easy enough, as a majority of the tech in the East ran on the same firmware. All they had to do was make a language translation, and that wasn't too hard in of itself. However, getting the game to America was an entirely different story. The MSX2 didn't exist in the States. Different energy consumption laws and regulations meant that America could use technology with greater capacities, whereas Europe and Asia had harsher restrictions, forcing everybody to use different televisions, computers, and yes, video game consoles. America was also wading through the video game industry crash during the 80s, but a console console war between Sega with its 16-bit console, the Genesis, and Nintendo's entertainment system kept the market afloat, eventually taking off at the end of the decade into the phenomenon we experience today. Konami would eventually pick a side and hired a group of developers to port Metal Gear to the NES to maximize profits and popularity. Though, as you can probably tell from the title of this video, this endeavor didn't quite work as smoothly as they would have wanted. In an interview with Hardcore Gaming 101 in 2012, one of the former developers from Konami, Masahiro Yuno, explained that the time restriction to get the port done was incredibly harsh. They were given a paltry 3 months to lift the game from the MSX2 architecture, reprogram certain parts of the game, translate it, and then publish their creations on the Famicom and the NES for a wider audience to enjoy. And enjoy they did, with Metal Gear landing as a smash hit in America and gather acclaim from multiple video game review outlets and fanatics alike. Players praised the interesting stealth mechanics and the resemblance to action movies like 007, Rambo, and Escape from New York. The game created a massive following and sold enough units for Konami to greenlight a sequel developed by an in-house studio, which was soon brought to life just 3 years later. But both of these events happening sequentially would get the attention of Mr. Kojima, as the creation of the NES port and Snake's Revenge were personally disappointing for him. Kojima has publicly stated before that he dislikes the NES version of Metal Gear as it's stripped of several elements of his own creation. Snake's Revenge was also completed by a totally different team than the one that created the first game, and thus had a wildly different tone. It was the publishing of these two games that got Kojima to stop making individual products like Snatcher and Policenauts, and return to his initial success story and create a proper sequel with a canonical storyline called Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. The thing that I find most interesting about this story is just how incidental everything is. A series of specific dominoes had to be pushed over for the franchise of Metal Gear to spiral into stardom, and I think that's incredible. What I find more fascinating though is that Kojima was satisfied with the original version of Metal Gear, but the NES version is reviled by him. And yet this is the version that history gets to look back on as the catalyst for the franchise's growth into a massive behemoth. It's this dissonance that grabbed my attention and got me to take a closer look into both versions of these games in the first place. The variance in gameplay and story gives you more than your time's investment, as you're basically playing two different games. Despite each having their audience, and each game arriving at a point in their game's canon that essentially meets the same requirements, the experience you get out of playing each version is surprisingly different and is certainly worth exploring. Both Metal Gear games start with an infiltration scene, where Solid Snake is dropped off at the massive facility known as Outer Heaven and is tasked with rescuing Foxhound operative Gray Fox and investigating something known only as Metal Gear. First off, holy crap, is this scene different immediately and drastic. In the MSX version, Snake infiltrates the base by wading through a drainage ditch that runs alongside the base's tank hangar. From there, he gets into the facility and uses his communications radio to call home base and let him know he successfully made it in. In the NES version, Snake is freaking parachuted into the jungle near the installation and has to make his way into the base on foot before anything else can happen. This jungle is fashioned similarly to a maze, with each screen showing how the area is structured only by proceeding a screen at a time. This means that there's 2 or more ways the player can advance through any of the given screens, with dead ends and varying levels of enemies being spawned in different screens. And on top of all of that, the player has to retrieve a key card from the back of a truck before they're warped to the actual Outer Heaven installation. As you traverse the halls of Outer Heaven in either game, you'll quickly encounter another design oversight that will probably change your playthrough entirely, depending on how much you rely on the stealth aspect of the game. In the original MSX release, the player can walk up from the side or behind enemies, and while they're unarmed, you can perform a 3-hit melee combo that defeats the enemy silently. This allows you to pick apart groups of enemy sentries patrolling an area to make it easier to progress, but especially in the MSX version, assisted the player in maintaining their support supplies. Enemies defeated by melee attacks would sometimes yield ammo boxes or rations. The probability was seemingly random, but by the end of the game, when the player has multiple weapons, this little design aspect saved players the trip of going back to older buildings and rooms to look for ammunition. This entire mechanic was removed or just not programmed into the NES version at all. Doesn't matter if you're attacking guards at the beginning, middle, or end. The enemy forces don't drop weapon ammo or rations whatsoever. The only enemies that dropped items were key-coded enemies that gave you a specific item that you needed to continue the game, like a key card or something. During the mission, Solid Snake will need to navigate the massive fortress by going through 3 buildings of varying shapes and sizes. These halls and rooms have a distinctive look to them and can easily be mapped if the player has a decent memory or maybe a pad and paper to jot down notes. While the general layout of each level is the same, between the MSX and the NES version, key items and weapons will be put in entirely different places, with certain guards taking different patrol routes. The strangest part is that for some reason in the NES version, guard patrols often take them right in front of or within a few feet of a room that the player can go into. Many rooms which contain valuable gear like the body armor, pistol silencer, and other key cards will have the player clear a soldier or two before actually getting into the rooms. But then if the player goes right back out of the same door, the guards will have respawned in the exact same place. Oftentimes this immediately triggers an alert phase, as the guards will see Snake standing there in front of the door. Depending on what door and what wall this happens on, the enemy support units will spawn and chase Snake until the player either gets to a different screen or he kills all the soldiers. The very first boss encounter in Metal Gear takes place in the prison ward of the first building's basement. Snake will encounter the foe shotgunner, a crazy gun-toting lunatic that fires a shotgun repeatedly in a spread. Once the player figures out how to defeat him, they're allowed to escape the prison and continue their mission to find Dr. Petrovich and his creation, Metal Gear. However, the game diverges here again in a major way. As in the MSX version, the player just has to navigate a few rooms with breakable walls in order to get the bomb blast suit and the Outer Heaven soldier uniform, and then move on. When the player is captured in the NES version, which happens in a different location I might add, you're actually warped to a different building altogether, and the way out after fighting Shotgunner leads you out into the jungle that connects all of the base together again. The blast suit and the enemy uniform are also in different places with much less security in them. Check out this fucking insane part of the game where you ascend to the building 1 rooftop, navigating the harsh winds using the blast suit and dodging enemy sentries as you proceed. You cross this shaky bridge that means an instant death, and just on the other side of it you're ambushed by flying soldiers using jetpacks to pursue you relentlessly. They zoom everywhere, shooting across the map and flinging themselves at you as they barrage you with machine gun fire. You have to dodge them and their gunfire constantly, even stopping in your tracks to fire a remote controlled missile into a power unit for the electric floor panels leading into this room that contains a key item. Even after you enter the room thinking you've found respite, they continue to pursue you. All of them dump through this little door to chase you, firing their guns and attacking you as fiercely as they did outside. It's not until you make it 2 or 3 screens over that they finally give up the chase, only for you to end up in a boss battle with a freaking helicopter. Only by blowing this thing up does the player finally get the rest they deserve and ready themselves for getting back into the building. In the NES version though, this is it. No pursuing guards, no fleet of jetpack soldiers, just a few stationary foes doing a little jig as they wait for you to approach. There isn't even a lot of them either. In the MSX version, there's like 4 of them flying around at a time, but in the NES version, there's only 5 of them spread out across 3 screens. Each of them is easily avoidable, and you can slip through this part completely unharmed. There's no tension here, no sense of urgency or pressure. You just have to make sure you stay within your boundaries, and that's about it. Such a stunning contrast, and it really blows my mind. This meaningless slog is so boring compared to the maniacal fight for survival the original brought, and this is like the entire end of the Building 1 infiltration. The vehicular boss fight at the end was completely changed as well. You don't even get to fight the Hind anymore. They replaced it with 2 stationary imaginary dudes firing machine guns. Granted, you still beat it the same way by hiding in the corner and lobbing grenades at it, but at least it was a more entertaining set piece. I mean, would you rather blow up a whole ass helicopter, or would you rather take out two dudes on machine gun turrets? I'll let you decide that one. In the MSX version, the player got to the courtyard of the first floor to obtain card 4 by parachuting off the edge of the roof behind the battle arena. This was necessary to infiltrate building 2, and the parachute was an item found on the second floor as you made your way up to the rooftop. The NES version seemingly hated this whole endeavor and completely removed the set piece from the game, deleting the parachute item entirely and instead giving the player early access to card 4 anyway. When you approach building 2 in the MSX version, the player has to navigate a minefield, which has invisible mines placed throughout multiple screens leading up to another vehicular boss battle, this time against a tank. Leading up to the tank battle, it will fire mortars at the player seemingly at random as they avoid the mines. Nearly all of this challenge is completely wiped away in the NES version, with the mortars being taken out entirely and the amount of mines being reduced to just the screen before and after the battle with the tank, which itself only uses a machine gun to attack you. As players begin to proceed through building 2, there are several times where they have to navigate these sections that are flooded, either by sewage or just through facility drainage. I like to think they attempted making it as a kind of waste material, as in the NES version it's colored gray and just overall looks more thick and goopy. But anyway, the sections where the player goes for a swim are handled slightly differently between both versions. There's these graded railings along the drainage ditches in the facility which mark where the player can and can't descend into them with gaps in the rail. In the MSX version, the player can be spotted if they cross a soldier's line of sight while within the ditch, forcing the player to take enemy patrols into account when proceeding through the base. There's a mini boss at the end of this ditch that is difficult if you don't approach it quickly, so there's added pressure to enter with full health and a loaded gun. The NES version simply does away with all this added tension by making it so that the soldiers can't see through the graded railings at all. The player is given full immunity to enemy sightlines and doesn't have to think about it as they navigate the first floor here. You can just cruise on by and see you later, buddy. After locating Petrovich and learning about Metal Gear's weak spot, the player is urged to get to Building 3 and destroy the machine. On your way there, the player has to navigate a desert plain that contains several families of scorpions just kinda hanging out. These dastardly devils will actually reach out and attack you, and their attacks are venomous. You'll get poisoned if they attack you, and there's only a single antidote item in Building 2 to cure you. And this isn't something that's avoidable either. There are so many scorpions placed in very inconvenient places that you're destined to hit one eventually. The goal is to make it to the other side and then use the antidote so you don't have to worry about being poisoned again. Once you make it to Building 3, you're basically home free. This tense situation is again stripped of any urgency in the NES version, as the scorpions are fewer in number and a bit more spread out, making it entirely possible to scoot past these dudes just by pulling out your gun and shooting them. Neat. This isn't so much a gameplay or a graphical change and is incredibly minor to the point of being nitpicky, but I think it's worth noting because the weird callouts would be a regular staple in Metal Gear games going forward. When the player finally makes it into Building 3, Snake is called by Big Boss repeatedly and is fed bits and pieces of really terrible advice. At one point he even calls you and tells the player to turn the MSX console off right away. Super creepy. Very jarring. The NES version has a much less creepy version of this in their script, as Big Boss will still call you, but in this conversation he simply tells the player to quit the mission instead of turning the game console off. I mean, again, this isn't so much a major mechanic or a graphical bug, so much as it's more likely to be just a localization failure, but still. Neither of these have the same level of creepiness as the AI Campbell from MGS2 though, not by a long shot. The ending of this game is probably the most egregious of slights though, as the final boss sequence is completely altered from its original counterpart, so let's go over it. No matter which version you play, Petrovich will tell you that you need to blow shit up with plastic explosives. games. So you need to enter the final arena with at least 16 charges. Your ammo capacity goes up throughout the game as you rescue more hostages, so entering the end of the game with a 4-star rank is basically required. So you free as many of the hostages as you can find, and you gather as many plastic explosives as Outer Heaven can provide, and you make it to the final boss arena. It's here that, depending on your choice of platform, that the player gets their last shocking twist. In the MSX version, the game proceeds as normal. Metal Gear stands at the end of the hangar while 2 weaponized cameras strafe the room targeting you. The player has to plant the explosives in a specific pattern to destroy the machine properly, so you play this mental hopscotch as you dodge incoming lasers and place the bombs down. Eventually you will succeed and the fortress will begin a self-destruct sequence, forcing the player out the side hallway. Upon entering this room, however, you're confronted by Big Boss, who reveals the big plot twist at the very end of the game. You're forced to do battle with him as the clock ticks down, threatening a massive explosion that will take you down with it if you're not quick. After defeating Big Boss, Snake will enter a room with 3 ladders that all head towards the surface, though only one of the ladders actually makes it to the top. If the player chooses incorrectly, they'll have to move back down the ladder to try another one, though each of the ladders are at different heights, and the player can technically choose incorrectly up to twice before finding the one that actually takes you out of the base. There's actually a hostage in Building 3 that will tell you which escape ladder is the correct one, saving you a little bit more time. After finding the correct exit, the player will be taken to a black screen where Solid Snake can be seen sprinting as hard as he can to make it away from Outer Heaven and its explosion. He follows it up with a callback to home base, reporting that he'd succeeded in his mission and gotten away in time. After which, the credits roll in the text box of the transceiver used throughout the game as the final theme plays in the background. In the NES version, this entire sequence is changed dramatically. The final boss of the game barely exists. The player will enter the room and be confronted by 4 guards in front of a massive computer console with an even bigger screen above it. The player has to dispatch the guards to avoid being damaged during the encounter, and they just don't respawn. Then, in no particular order, taking as much time as you want, the player can plant their explosives and detonate them repeatedly until the computer explodes, after which the console disappears entirely and the self-destruct mechanism activates and Snake must then flee. The player then encounters Big Boss as normal in the following room, though he doesn't explain as much about his operation like he does in the MSX version, and his attack pattern is much less aggressive. After the player kills him, they must choose one of 3 doors in the back of the room to enter, each containing an elevator instead of any ladders. If the player chooses the wrong elevator, well, they get stuck in the elevator shaft forever. The game is programmed to loop endlessly until the explosion timer runs out and kills the player and blows everything up. There is no way to change this. Once you're in that elevator, you're locked in till the end, baby. Choosing the right elevator will bring the player to the surface, and the game will cut to the same screen as the one that opened the game, with the jungle in the background and the mountains in the distance. The sky will then shimmer with different colors, and the sound effect of an explosion will play, followed by the final transmission of Snake reporting his success, which then continues into the credits roll afterwards, just like in the original. Holy guacamole. This thing sucks. Talk about anticlimactic. The entire premise of this game was sending a secret agent into a heavily fortified base with crazy military power that possesses a weapon of unknown origin and capability. To say that level of suspense was scaled back for the NES port is definitely an understatement. Missing or changed item placements is one thing, but to remove certain elements of the campaign entirely just feels completely reckless. When you compare the original and the ported version directly like this, it's a night and day difference. Removing ammo drops from enemies, scaling down the jetpack enemies, and swapping the helicopter boss fight, changing the location of Dr. Petrovich, deleting the freaking Metal Gear, then forcing the player into a death trap if they choose wrong at the final escape. It's a lot to swallow. And these are just some of the major changes I decided to go over. There's a bunch of little things that overall make the NES game a different experience entirely if you pay attention. For instance, Unlike the cameras in the MSX version, cameras in the NES game have a blind spot directly underneath them, allowing the player to move through certain areas easier. Guard dogs in the MSX version don't set off the sentry patrol alarm, can't be killed by melee attacks, and will detect you through walls and even different screens. In the NES version, they'll set off an alert phase when they spot the player, and they can be killed with your bare hands. When you rescue the fake Dr. Petrovich in the MSX version, the pitfall that opens underneath him will actually cause him to fall in after he does a wily coyote gag and looks down, whereas in the NES version he just kinda hangs out there, suspended in the air as he laughs at you. And despite being made specifically to cater to audiences in the West with an English translation, the NES port of this game has obnoxious and very apparent spelling mistakes in its limited dialogue. The truck have started to move. I feel asleep. Use the bomb blast suit to get past the window barriers. All of these are super easy, super simple mistakes. If the entire point of this version of the game was to make it presentable to an English-speaking audience, how in the hell do you screw something like this up so easily? I want to play devil's advocate here for a second though, because as much as I dislike this version of the game, there's a couple of things I'd like to point out that I think were actual improvements on the original, however minute they are. Firstly, despite some weapons and items being in totally different locations, some of them are actually incredibly easy to find and a lot more intuitive for basic exploration. Not everything needs to be behind an obscure crack in the wall or a door locked way beyond what you're expected to have in that instance. I appreciate that level of accessibility in an already frustratingly difficult game. I also appreciate the effort to make the pace of the game feel a bit more ironed out by adding locations instead of main buildings. Having a location that isn't the gray, blue, or green tiles of the main facilities is a breath of fresh air, even if the space in between is designed in an asinine way that requires navigation items so you aren't stuck in an infinite screen loop. Still, the effort is there and is appreciated. Probably the biggest change that really affects your general enjoyment of the game is the restructuring of your inventory system. Your items and weapons are categorized in the NES version, grouping items together based on what they are and what function they serve. In the MSX version, they're kind of just jumbled together based on what you acquired and when you acquired them in your playthrough. So you'll be scanning your entire inventory looking for your gas mask, or the latest key card, or the bulletproof vest, whenever you need it the most. Granted, time doesn't advance when you're in the menu, but the sense of pressure is real as you play the game, so this change to remove the clutter is definitely a good move towards better quality of functionality. At the end of the day, Metal Gear's launch on the NES paved the way for many more sequels and an entire franchise to be born. It was the NES's rushed development that led to drastic changes in Kojima's work, which directly led him to coming back to the rocky reception of the version of a sequel that was led without him. The NES port and Snake's Revenge were seen as immensely distasteful to him, so eventually Kojima came back to the MSX division to produce what he deemed as a proper and fitting sequel to his MSX version. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake again released to critical acclaim in the East and put him on track for greater things within Konami. Metal Gear Solid for the PS1 would be made with the vision of a global release targeting all audiences and acting as a soft reboot to get people everywhere invested in the story Kojima was trying to tell. And the rest, as they say, is history. Metal Gear's NES port sold an easy 1 million units in the first year and developed a legacy only a few hope to capture while they create their art. As messy and obviously rushed as this game was, it's an important piece of video game history and we should do our best to remember it as such, despite its modern negative retrospect. Nowadays, when a video game is released to terrible reception, the game is delisted from platforms, developers lose their jobs and money is burned, but sometimes we find a diamond buried in the rough, more valuable to the endless stretches of history than to any of us, even its creators and caretakers, no matter how big or impressive we become. Remember to stay awesome, don't forget to rewind, and have a wonderful night. Excelsior.